Chris Inglis, who's the former Deputy Director of the National Security Agency, the Chief of Operations of that agency. And my professional career with Chris goes way back to 1992 when we first met, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. One word that continuously is used in describing Chris Inglis's career is distinguished. Chris is a distinguished Eagle Scout to start with, a distinguished graduate of the Air Force Academy, a distinguished Guggenheim Fellow graduate student at Columbia University, a distinguished outstanding graduate of the Air College, and the distinguished visiting professor of cybersecurity at the U.S. Naval Academy. I could list a few more, but I'm sure you get the idea. Following graduation from the Air Force Academy, Chris became a pilot instructor in jet aircraft and also became certified as a command pilot in 7 different aircraft, including heavy transports. After serving 7 years of active duty in the Air Force, Chris joined the Maryland Air National Guard and became serving as a commander in the flight, squadron, group, and joint forces levels. He retired from the Maryland Air National Guard in 2006, having achieved the rank of Brigadier General and being the Chief of Staff of that organization. Chris's academic degrees are in mechanical engineering at both the bachelor and the master's levels, advanced graduate degrees in computer science, and he has taught computer science at both the U.S. Military Academy and the Naval Academy, where, of course, he is now teaching again. He joined the National Security Agency in 1986 as an information security analyst in NSA's information security system. The job of that particular system that he started in is to provide the encryption and protection of U.S. government communications, a major half of NSA's mission. The other half of NSA's mission is called signals intelligence, which involves the exploitation of designated foreign government communications. In 1992, at NSA, in recognition of both his technical and managerial skills, he was selected for the NSA Senior Executive Development Program. And although Chris and I had not previously met, for some strange reason, Chris asked me to be his mentor in the Executive Development Program. And 10 minutes into that interview, not only did I make the decision, yes, I was going to be this guy's mentor, but I was going to steal him away from his present organization and start his training in my organization. And that's exactly what I did. I also set forth a program to be sure that he got a full education in the arcane arts of signals intelligence. Chris was so impressive that I was convinced that one day he would indeed become NSA's deputy director, the senior civilian in the agency, and the chief operations officer of one of the most technical organizations in the United States government. And Chris more than met all of these expectations, served as deputy director from 2006 to 2014, and he was the second longest serving deputy director in the National Security Agency's 65-year history. Chris' honors and medals are frankly too numerous to mention, but I have to mention his final one. President Obama presented him with the President's National Security Medal in 2014, a most distinguished honor for an individual who has spent his entire professional life serving our country. And now, here is Chris to give you the presentation of today and to explain to you the arcane arts of cyber warfare and cyber defense.
Thanks, Phil. Thank you. It's at moments like this you wish your children to hear that they're paying attention. Right, so no pressure. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to turn your phone off, if you would just hold that up, point that towards me, I'd be happy to turn that off for you now. Of course, I can't do that anymore, right? So It's a real pleasure to be here. It's my first time at Dartmouth, kind of at this august age. I should have been here much sooner, but I've certainly heard about this institution, and NSA has benefited. Other organizations that I've been with have benefited from the expertise that is generated here and in other places up in this region, and so it's a delight, a pleasure to finally get here. I understand some number of you saw a movie on Stuxnet last week. How many of those? Great. So I imagine you had the same feeling I did when I saw Jaws, the movie Jaws, 30 years ago. So I saw the movie Jaws. I was about 1 million miles. It was Colorado Springs where I saw this movie. And when I got back to the campus, the Air Force Academy campus, I was so impressed with the movie, I would only stay on the sidewalks. I would not walk on the grass. Right? So it's a completely irrational, but nonetheless kind of well-earned fear. So we'll talk a little today about what's true, what's not in terms of those trends. I don't think that we should have irrational fear, but we should have a concern. We should understand what's really possible and what's actually going on in that space. And that's my job, I think, for the first 50 minutes or so, is to perhaps lay some of that out. In so doing, what I'm going to try to do is to describe a little bit about the nature of the space, what I call cyberspace. That deserves an explanation as to what is cyberspace. But I'll lay that out, talk a little bit about the nature of it. I'll lay something out about the nature of the actions that are taking place in that space and why we care, what things are at risk in that space. And I will suggest, at least at a strategy level, the things that we should be doing in that space, whether as individuals, organizations, private sector, public sector, governments, plural. There are some things that are well-worn traditions and protocols in our other domains of interest, whether that's in diplomacy or in the traditional land, air, sea, that we can drag into this space, but we'll find that cyberspace is unique in some ways, and we have to actually undertake some new thinking. And so I'll try to lay all that out, hopefully as a basis for a rich dialogue, whether it's out there on the lawn or back in here under the glare of the Klieg lights. If you'll permit me, I'd like to start with a joke. I know that's just terrible bad form, but I was trained by the Air Force. I have PowerPoint slides and jokes. So as Bill indicated in the introduction, I was an Air Force pilot for quite some time. I was pleased to be able to fly something generated by the military once a week for the better part of over 26 years, meaning I was happy once. And for a long period of time, I flew this thing called a C-141. Now, those of you not familiar with the kind of aircraft that's flown by the United States Air Force, it was a long time ago. It had technology that dated back to the 1650s. It had a sextant on board. But it was a 4-engine airplane about the size of a Boeing 707, and it was the workhorse, the backbone of the global strategic airlift community. And so we went everywhere. And as anybody who's flown airplanes before knows, is that the most dangerous period of flight is typically either the takeoff or the landing, but the takeoff because you're just ginning up and you really don't have a feel for the airplane. And the most expensive part of the flight is takeoff through the climb up to altitude. And so in this joke, this is an anecdote, a joke, so don't take this too seriously. But in this joke, we take off one day on a transcontinental flight, or I'd say a transoceanic flight. We take off and we kind of push the power up. Everything's working fine. You get to that magic moment, we break ground, and now you're struggling, kind of expending all of this energy. The engines are struggling forward to climb up to altitude. That's where most of your energy is expended. You get up to altitude on 4 engines and you're cruising along, and what you're next thinking about is getting to what's called the equal time point. That's the place from which there's no return, right? You do not have the gas, you do not have the energy to make it back, and so whatever happens, you're going forward. And at this moment in time, up at altitude, cruising over the Atlantic, the Azores somewhere out in front of you, passing the equal time point, we lose an engine. Engine fails. For pilots, this dirty little secret, for pilots, that's a moment of great and positive excitement because you have something to do, right? So you go through all the drill necessary to shut the engine down and to render it harmless, safe, kind of separated from all the other systems on the airplane. And then you have to actually account for the fact that you've lost this energy, so you have to reduce the power. It sounds paradoxical, but you reduce the power, you want to go a little bit slower to achieve a more optimal flight profile and go down to a lower altitude because you don't have the power necessary to sustain that. And so in the vernacular of the moment, you then announce to passengers and crew, lost an engine, not a problem. We have 4 engines so that we can fly on 3. We'll be a little bit lower, a little bit slower, but we'll make it just fine. Now, as this story goes, they then subsequently lose a 2nd engine. Pilots excited, perhaps not positively excited. This might be a trend. But he goes through the same drill and he announces to passengers and crew, that's why we have 4 engines. We can fly on 2 because we're already up at altitude. We've expended most of our energy. We'll be a little bit lower, a little bit slower, but we'll make it. You can tell where the story's going. They lose a third engine, right? So the pilot, now, he's not excited at all at this moment in time. He's very concerned, right? He's now kind of, gripping the reality. But he goes through the drill and he says, we're going to be a little bit lower, a little bit slower, and we're probably now looking for a destination short of the one we'd intended. But he announces to the crew, we'll be fine. We've got 4 engines because we can make it on 1 since we're already up at altitude, but we'll be a little bit lower, a little bit slower. At this point, one of the passengers looks at another passenger and says, well, hope we don't lose the last engine, because if we do, we'll be up here all day. So now I tell that story because all of you knew the wisdom of that observation, is that, the person seeing what happens when we lose 1 or 2 or 3, this is the logical knock-on sequence, right? Now, when we look at cyberspace, we have a similar, problem. We're seeing what's happening at the surface level. We think we therefore can extrapolate that into what that means. And unless you actually rip the cover off that box and understand what's happening underneath, you might be misled about what perhaps the safeties or the risks, the challenges, or the opportunities in that space might be. Which is why I think we need to go a little bit more deeply than you might otherwise want to about what the true nature of cyberspace is. I teach at the United States Naval Academy. The kids that show up there are just as nobly intended, just as bright, just as full of potential as the ones that show up at Dartmouth and other colleges that are on this link. But as opposed to our expectations that they are digital natives, having been raised in the midst of this stuff, they're not. They're app natives, right? They really don't know how the systems work because we've made it such that they don't need to. Apple, Google, others have succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, making these systems so intuitive that you simply kind of touch the screen in a way that makes sense to you as a human being, and the screen performs. The software underneath does what it's supposed to do. Or you stuff data, your dear secrets, into this system, and you assume that it's being protected. The system doesn't often unpleasantly surprise you, so that assumption kind of is extrapolated into perhaps grander assumptions about the safety, security of critical systems, those that generate water, those that generate distributed electricity, and so on and so forth. And so we find at the U.S. Naval Academy we need to step back and say, first and foremost, we need to tell you a little bit about what's really happening underfoot. When you kind of see a glossy, what we used to call a table magazine, kind of a coffee book, coffee table book, and you see this glossy picture on the front, and you wipe the face of that, and it doesn't go immediately to the second page, it's not broken, right? So it turns out that the technology underneath, actually has a function, and there's some depth of that function, and if you understand that, you'll understand the consequences of that. So if you'll permit me, I'd like to walk you through some of that. Because my assessment, and I'm now in the private sector doing some work there, I do a lot of defense work. I still, on a pro bono basis, do defense science board studies, things of that sort, teach at the Naval Academy, and looking across the expanse of the private and public sector, in the realm of cyberspace, again, I've not yet defined what that is, so I will, but in the realm of cyberspace, my sense is there are some really well-framed, well-formed best practices. By and large, as a society, organizations, we are still defending the wrong thing, in the wrong time, holding the wrong people accountable, focused on the wrong goal, and perhaps sometimes hysterical about the wrong problem. Otherwise, as I tell my students, you've only missed straight A's by 3 B's and a D. I will explain through the rest of the talk why I think this is true, and why, therefore, we're not necessarily focused on the right goals, holding the right people accountable, and what I think I mean by we need to focus on perhaps a different objective and essentially collaborate and integrate in a different way. But let's first go through some history. People think that anybody know what this is? It's an Enigma machine, right? Anybody seen the Imitation Game? It's a fantastic movie. Not enough American accents in the movie for my liking, but all the same, a pretty good movie and a pretty true telling of the story. So this, of course, is a box, a device that tries to, in an electromechanical form, replicate some mathematics that would take a message in plain form, scramble that so that you can send that across a shortwave radio link, and then on the other end of that, telegrapher does that work in between, on the other end of that, using the same box, set up the same way, you could recover the message. You could take the scrambled message and recover whatever is underneath that. Now, this was built and operated by the German Wehrmacht, right? You can tell that this is a German army machine because it's got 3 rotors in there. If it had 4 rotors in there, it would be a German Navy machine. But this, at the height of World War II, was communicating all manner of things around the Axis powers to essentially command ships at sea to show up in certain places, submarines to show up in certain places, armies to undertake certain maneuvers. And this, in my view, was the earliest instance that I'm familiar with of the true nature of the cyber war. Because the Germans, and on the other side of the planet, the Japanese, assumed that this system was safe because they had absolute high confidence in the technology underneath this. Of course, the system wasn't safe, as history will recall, because we actually broke the system, not the box. Because if you see the movie, you realize about a third of the way through the movie that Alan Turing, the hero of the movie, is pulling his hair out, says the box is actually pretty good. It's not perfect, but it's actually so good. The math in it is so good. The box is electromechanically so well designed that we can't break the box. But they came to the conclusion that we just might break them. We just might, in a brain-on-brain game, outwit the Germans. We might outwit the Japanese, the Axis powers, in their use of this, their assumptions of how it works, perhaps the mistakes that they might make. We might catch them in those. They might exercise some hubris, some arrogance. And so when I say this is what broke the Enigma system, I'm not pointing to the machine, I'm pointing to the person. She and people like her, that's what broke the German Enigma system. We assumed that they would make mistakes. We caught them in those mistakes. Those mistakes were fatal. And the audacity of the British, the Americans, the Five Eyes, the Australians, the Canadians, the Poles assisting us, the audacity of that group of people at a place called Bletchley Park in assuming that they could break that system, and then in undertaking the necessary mental capacity to do so, shortened by most historians' view the war by 2 years, saved hundreds of thousands of uniform lives, let alone untold disaster across those battlefields. But there was an equally audacious proposition that took place side by side. The Americans and the others, but the Americans and the Allied forces had their own system. Whereas the German system was called the Enigma system, we had a system called SIGABA. And if you looked at it, aside from the different form, slightly different form, it had rotors, it had electromechanical parts, it was largely the same system. Turns out that there's not a conspiracy between the Egyptians and the Mexicans to build pyramids 4,000 years ago using alien assistance. If you pile up rocks any other way, they fall down. Right? So it turns out that in this day, right, these systems are largely the same because that was the state of the art. But we were audacious enough on the defense to think that we could defend that system. Our adversaries weren't audacious enough to think that they could attack that system. And most historians say that our ability to communicate securely between ourselves, especially in the early days of the war when we didn't have the logistics or the tactics, shortened that war by 2 or 3 years and saved a greater number of lives than the offense. Defense is as important in this endeavor as is offense, and it's a brain game. It's more a brain game than it is a technology game, and I'll make that point again and again. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening in this space. So I'm going to show you a couple of insights, perhaps through a soda straw, about things that are happening in the space, again, before I define what the space itself is. If you look out on the internet under a website called informationisbeautiful.com, and you search on that website for a thing called breaches, computer breaches, cyber breaches, you'll get a chart that looks like this. And what this represents, sorted 2 ways, what this represents is all of the breaches that have occurred in cyberspace of some consequence on a global basis. And it will allow you to sort this 2 ways. First, you can say, I want to see the sectors that have been impacted: financial sector, government sector, military sector, banking sector, academic. I want to see all of the implications of this, all of the consequences. And the second way it lets you sort this is I want to see all the causes. So I want to see the causes that are attributable to, say, human error, to technology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I've now turned on both, right, of these. The little chart on the right-hand side, this is actually an interactive chart, but I've got a static picture of it. And so I've said I want to see all of the causes, that's down below, and I want to see all of the consequences. Those are the sectors that have been impacted. A lot of bubbles up there. And they're bubbles that if you could see them close in, you'd say, oh, I recognize that one. The Target, the Home Depot, the Office of Management and Budget, the theft of 21 million federal records. They're all up there. So I'm going to now show you the chart when I turn off one thing. What I'm going to do is turn off the causes attributable to technology, meaning I'm going to show you all impacts and only those causes attributable to humans. Don't blink. That's it. Now, for those of you that were paying very rapt and close attention, there's a very small bubble in the upper right-hand corner that just disappeared, right? It was attributable wholly, solely to technology fault. Every other one of the bubbles up there, every other one of the breaches is attributable to what? Human error, human malfeasance, human mistake, human hubris, human arrogance. Right? That's going to be a theme throughout the talk. So this is a denial of service attack. I'll explain what that is in a second, that occurred between 2012 and 2013. 200 different days across that time frame some group of somebodies got up in the world and constituted what's called a denial of service attack against banks, financial institutions, largely quartered in the United States, but it's a globally interconnected system, and so it's spread to a lot of other places. Now, what's a denial of service attack? In practical terms, a denial of service attack is like having your front door at your house attacked with Nerf balls. Somebody's got a bazillion Nerf balls, and they're throwing those Nerf balls at the front door. They don't harm the front door. They don't destroy, destruct, otherwise permanently kind of damage the front door, but they make it impossible for you to find it, right? Such that when you want to legitimately get into your house, you can't because it's obscured. Denial of service attack might be if you're trying to log on to a website, say it's bankofamerica.com, denial of service attack would be hurling requests at that website to, hey, let me log on without credentials. It tries to then service that request. It tries to say, do you have a credential? Do you have a password? You don't. It then ignores you, but it does that trillions of times a second such that you can't get to that front door. That's a denial of service attack. When it stops and the Nerf balls blow away and the sun shines again, the bank is no worse for the wear, except there's been an opportunity cost in between where its legitimate customers have not been able to get access to their accounts. Financial transfers haven't occurred. The opportunity costs are significant, severe in some cases, because the customers themselves lose confidence in that front door and say, maybe I'm going to take my business elsewhere. On this chart, if you're a blue dot, you're receiving those Nerf balls. You're essentially a victim of attack. And if you're a large blue dot, it's a pretty severe attack. If you're a red dot, you're hurling the Nerf balls, right? And if it's a large red dot, you're hurling a lot of Nerf balls. If you're a yellow dot on this chart, then you're a piece of a global infrastructure, computers around the world that have essentially been taken hostage by whoever's doing this, such that at a moment's notice, you can turn into a red dot and begin to hurl these bots. It's a very dynamic, very flexible, very creative, clever system. Now, the question that I would ask, this is at the moment this was created, a top secret chart created by NSA using all sorts of secret methods, all legitimate, all done by the rule of law. We'll talk about that later. But it was classified in those days because the means by which it was derived in real time was classified. But I would ask you, looking at this very accurate chart, who's doing this? Who's up to no good in this particular endeavor? You're right, the Iranians. It's as plain as the nose on your face. You can see it, just jumps right off the chart at you. Turns out it's really hard to see, because if you don't actually understand what the second and third order aspects of this are, if you can't penetrate beneath the fabric to try to put together who's who in the zoo, it's almost impossible to determine. And this is a problem today because people who are the victims of this and say, I just want to do something, look out and see what is perceived to be the aggressor, only to find that they're going to go back after somebody that themselves is a victim in an earlier phase of this attack. And the Iranians did this 200 different days between 2012 and 2013. They themselves might say that they weren't the provocateurs in this. They were simply responding to some provocation that occurred elsewhere, right across the great long arc of history. That's an issue. We'll talk a little bit about that. This next one, you've all seen this. It turns out that in the upper left-hand corner, that's not Edward Snowden, that's the actor playing Edward Snowden, but there are two actors up on this chart. Edward Snowden, the other actor in this case, he's in the lower right-hand corner. I mention this not to actually challenge the ideological premise. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want, but rather to say that there are many kinds of threats in this world. There are the kinds of threats that were indicated by those breaches where aggressors are actually stealing your data, perhaps holding your data at risk, the ransomware attacks encrypting your data so you can't get access to it, destruction, theft, denial. There's the second kind, which is the Nerf balls of the world, which is essentially trying to disrupt it for some period of time. And then there are people who have extraordinary insider privilege who abuse those privileges for whatever reason. Might be ideological, might just be because they're just having a bad day. But all of these constitutes threats to your otherwise good use of the system. Your expectations the system's going to be there for your benefit is disrupted, perhaps challenged by the existence of all of these. So let's back up, if those in fact are some representation of the threats, to say, why do we care about this space? What's actually in this space in the first place? Why does this matter to us? I'm going to do that two ways. One, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the tangible aspects, tangible components of the space. Most of this won't surprise you, but perhaps I'll tease out some things that might be kind of consequences of the way the space is built that do surprise you. That's my job. And then secondly, I'll talk a little bit about the things that are happening alongside that exacerbate or compound this. So when I joined NSA in 1985, somebody had said, what is the internet? I would have said, I have no earthly idea. But after a long kind of series of perhaps Socratic questions, somebody got me to say, what is it today, 1985? This was it. In 1985, there was a telecommunications system largely of a manual nature, such that there were links that would connect devices around the world, and using either a telephone that you in those days dialed, or a fax machine that you could in those days begin to punch buttons on, or a telegraphy unit that you could send things across shortwave radio link, you could cause communications to flow from one point to another. Largely manual affair, meaning the human being had to take some tangible, discrete action in order to get that communication to flow. So that's property one. Largely humans are in charge, still in charge. Thing two is that it was a very transient thing. Communications didn't live in this space, they simply transited this space. Right? They simply, from point A to point B, would make their way across. If you wanted to hold those communications at risk, your NSA in World War II trying to hold the Wehrmacht at risk, that was your moment in time. You needed to catch it while it was going from A to B. If you didn't, game was over. Right? If you were defending that communication, you only needed to defend it between points A and B. But the third thing, the third characteristic, is the thing that's been remarkable in terms of the consequences ever since, which is that because that was only in that space from point A to point B, it wasn't permanently retained by that space, and therefore there was no permanent kind of instantiation of that thing, that communication in that space, and therefore we were not tempted to have that be the only representation of the material value it represented. Let me be clear about that. Right? In those days, a communication typically reflected something happening in the outside world and almost never represented the representation, the unique and sole representation of that thing in the space itself. I had a bank account when I was a small child in this day and age, and that bank account was represented typically by what was called a passbook. And if the passbook had not been certified or stamped to have a certain amount of money associated with it, if there wasn't some greenbacks, some currency that actually was represented physically in that space, I didn't have any money. Today, my money is represented by ones and zeros that are stored in this space. There's no other representation of that. I might get occasionally a physical, graphical, right, kind of instantiation of that, but the principal way that that money is represented is ones and zeros in that space. How did that change? Well, remember that this space increasingly had these very sophisticated devices attached to the edge of it. Not just the old dumb telephone instruments that we knew as children, but these things that had some smarts embedded in them, right? That had some ability to do things that exceeded your expectations. This is when the kind of video cassette recorders came in and were blinking 12 maddeningly at us all the time. It needed something more. It had some function that it tried to execute. But what really then happened, somewhere in the early 1990s, was those devices became sufficiently powerful that we could actually offload to them the choice of how to communicate the thing that we wanted to send, at what time and in what way, using what pipes. That's your problem. I don't want to worry about that anymore. And when that began to happen, we inserted this layer, this layer in between that doesn't really exist, but it's there for all practical purposes, logic layer, where the system began to take on some function on our behalf. It said, I'll figure this out for you. I'll tell you how that's going to get there from point A to point B. Matter of fact, I won't tell you, I'll just do it. I'll just exceed your expectations. And then beyond that, began to say, tell you what, since the person that you want to communicate with isn't awake now, you're in America, they're in Korea, I'll just hold it inside the system until such time that they come calling for it. That was, in my view, when I first heard of email, the miracle of email. It wasn't that it could find anybody on the planet. We'd been able to do that forever. It was that it would retain this stuff inside of itself, wherever the devil that was, and essentially would wait for you. We began to store stuff in the space. That's when we were tempted then to say, well, darn, if this is a great repository, why do I have another version of this thing in the outside world? I'll just store it in the cyberspace. And so cyberspace took on a fundamentally different character, despite the fact that it was once a telecommunications domain where, hey, if somebody steals my communication, I still have the stuff. Now the stuff is only in cyberspace. But here's the real deal, which is all of that was being developed in a context that had bookends of people on the one side. That's the whole point of domains of interest on the planet Earth. People on the one side who have inherent characteristics, either aspirations or rights, inalienable rights in our society. And on the other end, geography. Why is geography important? Not just because of its physical reality of how things get from one place to another on the planet Earth, but geography is typically where we define jurisdictions. We come up with rule sets. We apply those rule sets. And these two bookends have some expectations based on our prior experience about what happens in the middle. But these bookends, if we extend them kind of absolutely into this space, will break our heart. There are, at this moment in time, I think, probably 3.6 billion people making use of the internet. Not literally at this moment in time, but on a daily basis, 3.6 billion people or so. That's a pretty healthy proportion of the world's population. But at this moment in time, there are about 4 or 5 billion persona in cyberspace. What's a persona? That's actually something that represents itself as being kind of a thinking, sensing creature. That is something that you might perceive as a human being in that space. But when you actually do the mapping back to an actual person, some of those persona map back to, multiple persona map back to one person. And so the relationship between what you see in cyberspace and what actually exists in the real world is not a one-to-one correspondence, and it's oftentimes a fake relationship. In the world of the dark space, which is an internet that essentially is outside of our typical daily view, but it's 100 times bigger than the visible space, by most estimates, it's only possible to figure out what the true identity is of about 1% of the characters, the persona that are operating in that space. So that's an issue up on that top layer. Bottom layer is even more pernicious. If you ask someone, I ask the midshipmen this all the time, how does a communication in cyberspace get from the east coast of the United States to the west coast of the United States? They all go, I've taken geography, that's an easy question. I'll take that question because the next one now is going to be hard. Turns out this is the trick question. They say that communication leaves the east coast of the United States, proceeds on a westerly heading, a couple of milliseconds later gets to California, 3,000 miles. Next question, please. Turns out cyberspace knows that's not necessarily the right answer. Why? Because cyberspace knows that at this moment in an American day, people are waking up all across the country. Cats are playing piano on YouTube, right? Hand over fist. Breitbart and all manner of other news feeds are beginning to kind of populate our bias. And so the pipes are clogged, enormously clogged between here and San Francisco. So it turns out cyberspace says the more intelligent answer might be, let's assume that people have gone to bed in places like Europe, Asia, and such, and those pipes are perhaps less clogged. We'll send that communication east. We'll send it across the Atlantic, Europe, Asia, and we'll get it to San Francisco. Maybe not as fast as it would on a clean line, but faster than if it has to contend with the clog lines. And so that's what it does. Now, if that communication is an order from Washington, D.C. to some submarine base in Oregon to essentially deploy 4 submarines out to monitor the east coast of North Korea, and you assume that because it's traversed, right, those 2 points inside the United States, that it's safe, that it's inside your garrison, it's inside a sanctuary, you might be surprised to find out that all manner of people have been able to look at that communication as it races underfoot around the world, and so on and so forth. All sorts of consequences derive from not understanding how that really works. Put all these things together and you get the true nature of cyberspace, and I don't mean to complicate the affair, but to say that most solutions that people bring to bear in cyberspace talk about one of these layers. They say, well, let's solve the people issue, or let's solve the device issue, let's solve the link issue, as opposed to solving all of these. This is a vertical space. A person connected to many devices who makes use of that autonomous logic layer, connected to the links, who actually has some place in the world, some jurisdictions that then pertain. That's what actually is happening in any particular engagement in cyberspace. And unless you think about all of those at once, atomically bound to another, you're destined to fail. Now, I'll simplify that a bit. So I'm going to bottom line say that I think cyberspace is essentially the meld, the atomic binding of technology and people and what I might call procedure, the things that essentially kind of are the expected activities between the two. The distinction that I'm really trying to get to is that when people say it's just a pile of technology, it's just a commodity, it's just like the motor pool, can't we just get the technology to bend to our purpose? They're misperceiving what the real deal is, which is that people are an integral part of this. The Wehrmacht, the Japanese Empire, didn't understand that in World War II and lived to regret it. We continue to this day to think that if we just double down on the technology investments, they're important, but that if we just do that and that alone, that we'll get this just fine. But people are the weak link. When somebody comes after you in cyberspace, more often than not, they're coming after you. They're not coming after your smartphone. They're not coming after some piece of software that you're using. Now, there might be what's called a zero-day vulnerability in the mix, but they're looking for you to have not patched it. They're looking for you to misunderstand its use. They're looking for you to take some risk, to exercise some arrogance, to perhaps make a mistake. You know, when the Russians presumably went after the Democratic National Committee, they weren't after some inanimate object or a server. They were trying to get somebody to make a mistake, somebody to click on a link that they shouldn't have, somebody to do something that then constituted the weak link in that system so that they could then steal those emails and use them for some ulterior motive. The human was the weak link in that. So what then do we do about that? I think we have to put the technology in a context, and so I would say the following about technology, because then I'm going to talk about some other trends that essentially compound this. First, the technology creates dependencies that in turn create existential risks. If you are dependent upon the resilience and robustness of the bits that flow in this infrastructure, the data in this infrastructure, to generate your power, to cause that power to flow, to perhaps properly charge power for that power, and that dependency is not well understood and not well defended, that can become an existential risk for your society. So we need to think about that. Second, the innovation in this space occurs at the edge. That's where the roil is taking place. As individuals use technology in ways that hadn't been anticipated, as individuals perhaps use software in ways that the underlying technology wasn't designed for, that innovation is rich and ongoing and takes place at the edge in a way that exceeds our expectations in all the positive ways. We will solve cancer because you've got literally hundreds of millions of people combining their efforts at the edge to make use of these technologies, the software, the data inside of it in very profound and valuable ways. It can't be controlled from the center. But the mission assurance that we're looking for in terms of is it resilient, is it robust, is not one and the same as the technology assurance that is often guaranteed by the technology providers. Technology provider will say, I guarantee this thing will be on and it will pass bits. I won't guarantee that the human component of this or that the mission assurance, that is the confidence you have that it's going to work under all conditions, I can't guarantee that because that's dependent upon things I, the technologist, can't control. Applications and all the purposes are open-ended, multiplying things that can and do wrong. Most computers that we have, even your cell phone increasingly, are what's called general purpose computing devices, meaning that you can put just about any kind of an app on it to do something new and different that you might not have thought about last week. It's open-ended in terms of its purpose. There are embedded processors that are kind of idiot savants. They might live in your refrigerator, and all they do is they turn the compressor on at a given temperature or the given condition, and therefore have very limited function. It's hard to make them go wrong, unless, of course, we start to consider computers, or we start to think of refrigerators and stoves and dishwashers as general purpose computers and perhaps begin to work software there and have them do things that exceed our expectations. That open-ended nature makes it such that makes it more complicated in ways that aren't helpful. And here's the bottom line, adversaries are ever present. I tell my kids at the Naval Academy, I say, this is not Y2K repeated. Now, they all look at me and say, what is Y2K? So it's a good question. Most of us in the audience probably remember Y2K. That was that moment in time when we'd created a whole bunch of software in the 1960s. And remember, the 1960s, the processors weren't that big, the software was very cumbersome and not terribly overperforming. And so when we came to actually encode the year for a particular application, we said numbers, spaces inside this are very expensive. So as opposed to putting in 1954, a great year, by the way, as opposed to putting in 1954, let's just say 54. We all know that's 1954. We'll save two bits in this, actually many more bits, 2 characters in this, and we'll be the better for it. And we said, and if the year 2000 ever comes, oh my God, that will never come, right? But if the year 2000 ever comes, we will have replaced this technology with one after another, not realizing it's just a continuous development of the same technology base. And so now the year 2000 is hoving into view, and we're thinking we might wake up one day and all the computers will say, it's not the year 2000, it's the year 1900. Computers didn't exist, we should all just turn off and go to sleep. And all of our critical processes stop. And so we fixed that. We worked our tails off for the better part of 5 years before the year 2000 to fix that, and it became a non-event. Right? Now, that's not what's going on today. That was a technology issue. It was one of our own creation, and there weren't people actively kind of interfering with our attempt to fix it. This is different. Right? This is not just a technology issue. I've already made the case that this is a human issue, and there are adversaries who are actively conspiring to interdict our efforts to fix this thing. So we can't just lock it down and say, everybody kind of let's fire a gun, get everybody out of the pool, walk around with a clipboard and take notes. We can't do that because there are actually adversaries on the field. That makes this different. But if you thought that was complicated enough, let me just give you 4 more trends, and we're going to go to solution space, I promise you. But I need to go through this one more thing, which is that's all technology, and I've actually participated, I perpetrated this extensive kind of perhaps conspiracy to say it's all about the technology, it's broken our hearts, we should just get those technologists to kind of come around and then we'll be okay. It's not that simple. There are 4 other trends taking place side by side with this technology, this inexorable rush of technology that actually complicate this. The first of these I've already mentioned something about, a new geography. That we increasingly don't think about our opportunities and we don't exercise those opportunities using traditional geography, physical geography. We think about that increasingly using internet geography, virtual geography. I've already told you about the assumption you might make about how communication flows. That's not necessarily how cyberspace thinks of it. But think of Uber, think of Airbnb, think of Lyft, think of all those companies who at the end of a year have no physical inventory. How do they think about their markets? How do they think about the business that they're in? They think about this business of, I can find my customers by reaching out to them across this geography called the internet. I can manage their resources or somebody else's resources against their needs to essentially effect a profit for myself. But they have no assets other than the virtual geography of the internet itself that makes for some profound differences in terms of how people think about the role of physical territory, the role of jurisdictions that are typically rooted in that physical territory. If you're a company operating in that new virtual geography and you have a cyber breach, you typically have to report to 54 different jurisdictions just by operating across the length and breadth of the United States. 54 states and territories all have fundamentally different notions about how that breach should be reported and how the accountability should be affected in that space because they're wed to physical geography, despite the fact that there's a new geography. But there's something more pernicious, which is a new social order. This is the kind of increasing propensity of people to organize not by physical geography, not by proximity, physical proximity, but by ideology. Now, when I was a kid, my mother said I was big boned, meaning that I was, about the same weight, but 12 inches shorter. My friends would have said fat and dumpy. And I lived for great stretches of time in dark spaces in the basement. And I had two opportunities kind of staring me in the face. One was to spend the rest of my natural life down there, essentially just kind of, increasingly in a fetal crouch. Or I could physically get up out of the basement. I could go join the Boy Scouts. I could go to the schoolyard. I could approximate myself physically, right, to opportunities in the world, make friends or not, and essentially see my way through the rest of life. There's now a third opportunity, because lurking in the corner of that basement is this thing called the internet, and you can reach out and touch, be touched, inspire, be inspired by people you'll never meet, causes you'll never encounter. We have a great concern in the United States, as they do in Europe, about this thing called lone wolf terrorist, which is that somebody born and raised in a particular society, who we think for all the world, he's one of us, she's one of us, right? So they were born in Birmingham. How could they feel anything other than, they have this British kind of identity, who one day gets up and goes out and commits murder and mayhem against their citizens. And you say, I never saw them talk to somebody that radicalized them. I never saw them physically approximate themselves to something that perhaps got them to have an identity other than the one that they were born with. And this mystifies us because we don't understand that we're creating organizations, we're creating enterprises that have no physical instantiation. They only have an ideology, and they have this way of communicating and connecting that ideology to people across the internet. I put Edward Snowden in this camp. He was an organization of one living amidst 50,000 other people. And our expectations that he would essentially feel like if he had a grievance or a gripe, he would come to that organization first, as opposed to taking that outside the organization and doing enormous harm to the organization that essentially was his physical home, was not an appropriate, was not a matched expectation with reality. This is an issue for us. We need to then think, if you give someone privilege and your expectation is because they're physically bound to you, they're physically inside that territory, do they have an identity that says, my fealty, my loyalty be here as opposed to there, when there is also present but not visible because it's part of the virtual infrastructure. Finally, there's the continuance, there's two more, but there's the continuance of disparities. What do I mean by that? There are people who have money, people who don't. There are people who have religious respect, there are people who don't. There are societies who perhaps think that they were born lucky, kind of in a particular place or in a particular kind of hereditary kind of chain, and people who don't. And the reason I mention that is that's been the source of collaboration and competition and conflict for time immemorial. But I mention that here because those reconciliations, whether it's through one of the positive or the negative mechanisms that I just indicated, those reconciliations increasingly take place in and through cyberspace. I'll mention an example or two in a moment. And geopolitics finally continues apace. Right? There are countries who collaborate through alliances, coalitions. There are countries who compete, perhaps financially, perhaps sometimes through proxies. And there are countries who have conflicts, but that geopolitics plays out on the world stage. And increasingly, all of those are taking place in and through cyberspace. Why does Iran attack U.S. financial infrastructure 200 times, 2012, 2013? Possibly because they perceive a disparity of respect, possibly because they're trying to reconcile a grievance they think that was imposed upon them, possibly because there's some geopolitical play playing out, but mostly because cyberspace is for them the most efficient, effective way to reconcile that grievance. Why does North Korea attack Sony Pictures in and through cyberspace? Possibly for each of those last 2 points, but so on and so forth. Increasingly, we're seeing this reconciliation take place in cyberspace. So the great news is that cyberspace is increasingly a tool for productivity and transformation. We see it everywhere you look, whether that's predicting weather, curing cancer, the sorts of things that give rise to the Arab Spring in 2011, where people who never met each other, didn't essentially kind of exercise physical geography, but had a common ideology, all of a sudden one day come out of their basements and out of their various quarters to the Tahrir Square and essentially rally for this thing that, from at least our perspective, we say is a great unbridled good. However, side by side with that, crime has used the same mechanism, whether it's the Russian business network, whether it's the dark web, whether it's the recent ransomware attack, WannaCry, they've used the same mechanism to hold us at risk. Ideology, you can kind of look at Chelsea Manning, what she did. You can look at the Arab Spring, very positive. You can look at Edward Snowden, not in my view positive. ISIS, ISIL, WikiLeaks, and so on and so forth. All manner of persons who are essentially organizing by ideology and using cyberspace as a way to exercise their aspirations. You can look geopolitics, and I'll have a string here because I'm going to get to a place where I say that we've just reached an inflection point, which I have what has largely been talked about as the largest theft of wealth and treasure, the intellectual property theft by the Chinese from perhaps 2006, 2015. That's taking place in this space. You've got on top of that Stuxnet in 2010. We can talk a little bit about that. You've got on top of that the Iranian attacks that I've mentioned. You've got the North Korean attack on Sony Pictures. You've got the Russian attacks on the Ukrainian electrical sector. For those of you that didn't see that, December of 2015, we believe the Russians shut down an area the size of Texas, 220,000 customers in all, just shut the electrical system down cold. And the good news was the Ukrainians had not made their controls completely digital, meaning they still had manual ability to open those electrical systems for the flow of electricity again, and we're able to do that within a few short hours. Imagine, however, an electrical system company that says, we're going all digital, all of our controls are on the network, those things are open such that the electricity stops flowing. They're then destroyed such that you can't reach onto that network and actually close those breakers again. And they have a denial of service attack. Russians did all three of those things, a denial of service attack such that the responders can't respond. Imagine that happens in a place like the United States where we have no backstop, we have no manual procedures to essentially get back at that again. That's a big deal. But the last thing I put on this list, I put here because I think that we've just hit an inflection point, which is Russian information war on the West in the year 2016. And in particular, an information war prosecuted against us. I think it's different in kind, and let me explain why on the following chart. I'm going to talk about information war, talk about cyber war as two different things. I'm therefore going to talk about this at three levels. At the first level, what you might say is a foundational level, most computer scientists, most theorists, political theorists, have been thinking their way through this for the better part of 15, 20 years. They say, look, at an infrastructure level, when we look down and we see underneath of us these pathways, these devices, and we see people making use of them, we are clearly cognizant of the fact that people want to steal that data. That's called computer network exploitation. They might want to disrupt or destroy that data. That can be called computer network attack, but we've been watching that for 15, 20 years, and sometimes participating in that by using that for our own intelligence and surveillance methods, sometimes participating in that by perhaps using that as another instrument of national power. But we're clearly aware of that. But what really makes that important is that actually then is directly supporting a struggle, a competition, or a conflict that's happening as a matter of abstraction at a level higher than that. It's really not about the bits, it's not about the data, it's not about the infrastructure, it's about those things that depend upon it. Why do the Iranians kind of do the denial of service attack on the infrastructure? Not for its own sake, but because they want to shut down the bank. It's about the financial system, not about the bits, not about the infrastructure. That level of abstraction is really important, and it's direct. The flow of electricity, the flow of water, the generation of nuclear power, voting systems depend upon those bits, depend upon that infrastructure. That's a second level, a really important abstraction of the first level. And we need to get our head up and think about that level as we're actually thinking about the technology that lives at the first level. But in 2016, we experienced a third level, which is an attack on the confidence of a nation, an attack on the psychology of a nation. And this is not so easily abstracted from those first two levels. You have to actually stand back and really think about this, ponder this for a moment to say, were the Russians in 2016 actually just trying to steal bits from John Podesta? Of course not. They're trying to steal his emails. And was it just about the emails? That it was at that second level of abstraction, it was just about the emails? No, there's something more going on here. Was it that they were trying to change a single vote from yes to no or no to yes? Well, you might think that. But it was actually about something more. It was at this third level. It was actually an attack on the confidence of a nation. It was an attack on us so that we might then either be distracted or perhaps turn inward and kind of take these fissures that have been bothering us for quite some time and exacerbate those and start an internal discussion that bordered on competition or conflict and create a democracy at war with itself. And if that's the game, then cyber plays a role, but it's not about cyber. It's about this larger, now existential activity. And cyber is implicated in this, but it's not entirely responsible for this. It's really about the human component that's taking advantage of it, not just a technology component that perhaps makes it such that it's possible in the first place. And so my point is that we can talk about the foundations. That's a cyber war. That's a conflict between and amongst bits. We can talk about the strategic leverage you get by that direct abstraction into the critical systems that we depend upon around the world. But the most important thing that's held at bay here, that's held at risk here, is the strategic effect that it has on societies. The Russians didn't need to steal a single vote. They didn't need to succeed in stealing one single vote all across 2016 to create the effect that they've helped create. Now, we were kind of a ready-made target, but they didn't need to do any of that stuff on levels 1 and 2. They simply needed to essentially invest enough effort to achieve the strategic effect that they did at level 3. So let me talk a little bit about two things, and then I'm going to go to solution space, and then I think we'll have something to think about. You can either attack me on the lawn or back in here during questions and answers. But first and foremost, as you'll hear from Bill Perry next week, he's an extraordinary speaker. He knows, he has the depth of expertise on so many strategic activities that I think you'd be more than pleasantly surprised. And one of the things he's particularly good at, he is one of the creators of, is strategic nuclear deterrence, which essentially says that if nuclear weapons are a dominant offensive force, meaning that when you use them, you simply dominate, you essentially obliterate the opposition, then we have to have a strategy for dealing with those. There are some who would say that cyberspace constitutes an opportunity to take all of those hard-won theoretical concepts and bring those into this space. I'm not of that camp, and I don't think he is either. I would say that whereas nuclear weapons are dominant, cyber weapons, the sorts of things that I would tell you about, they're persistent. Right? They essentially persist, but they're not dominant. Right? And there's this interplay between defense and offense that's more like a scrum than it is this overwhelming overmatch of a tsunami wave coming ashore. And therefore, with that kind of caution in hand, I'm going to extract some of the concepts from nuclear deterrence theory to say these things just might help us. And as in traditional deterrence or defense theory, you have to first figure out what it is you're trying to defend. You have a good sense as to what it is you care about, what you hold near and dear, such that you would say, I'm willing to invest some time and energy defending that. Now back to my first slide where I said, we're defending the wrong thing in the wrong time. Many companies, many organizations, many nations have no idea what they're trying to defend. They're trying to defend bits, they're trying to defend links, they're trying to defend devices. That's not at all the case. They're trying to defend the abstraction of that, which might be the critical capabilities, or hopefully more importantly, they're trying to defend their strategic equities. That's the focus, that's got to be the goal. And so you need to first and foremost think, what are my strategic aims, and then map those back down into these bits count, these don't. Right? Some of these things you don't need to defend. Sony Pictures trying to defend some of those emails, if you're familiar with the case, it's a fool's chase. They shouldn't have written those emails in the first place. Right? Those things were just shameful. Not that any of us haven't thought about writing emails like that, but the fact that you did and then you're trying to defend them, it's a fool's chase. So the foundation is always define, declare your priorities. That has two beneficial effects. It motivates your own efforts. You kind of spend those in a priority-wise, efficient fashion. And it also declares to those that you would perhaps send notice to, hey, I care about this, and you're on notice. If you hold this at risk, I'm going to care about this. I'm going to come after you. If you make no statement whatsoever, then you confuse at best your adversary. They're like, hey, you don't care. The Chinese might say to us, you put all of this critical information on your unclassified networks? I thought you wanted me to have it. I took a copy, I left the original, trust me. Right? The original blueprints are all still there, we're good, right? These copies are free. That's nonsense, but we never declared that in the first place. Building on top of that, however, we have to actually make sure that the architecture is in fact defensible, that it's resilient. Now, the kind of traditional, what's called information assurance methods, people who invest in software and hardware and the definition of doctrine procedures, this is well-worked territory. Computer scientists have been doing this forever. Make a defensible architecture. But it turns out that's not enough. You have to actually exercise some vigilance. You have to actually defend it. Those are two different things. Having a defensible house with locks and doors and proper windows and perhaps a fence does you no good whatsoever if you leave the door open, if you go away for great stretches of time with the lights on and the curtains open, with the kind of most valuable assets sitting up there on the mantelpiece. Having a defensible house has to go hand in glove with actually defending it. In so many cases in cyberspace, we think, well, we've got a system that can defend itself. We've invested all the necessary hardware, software, stuff. We leave on a Friday, we leave the system wide open, come back on a Monday, and we wonder why there's the equivalent of virtual broken glass all over the floor, because it wasn't defended. We weren't exercising vigilance. And you have to presume breach. You have to presume these things are not defensible in the absolute, that at best they are defensible but weak, kind of perhaps porous vessels that something's going to get inside, and you need to find it inside as much as you need to look for it coming over the berm. I have 3 children. I love them all dearly. I have one of each. One of them is a submarine officer. One of them is a submarine officer. It broke my heart, right? He was accepted at the United States Air Force Academy, accepted at the United States Naval Academy. I'm bragging to my friends, this kid's going to the Air Force Academy. How cool is that? And he goes to the Naval Academy. And graduating at the Naval Academy, he decides he wants to kind of be lower and slower, so he's now driving a submarine, right? So he's out there in submarines. And he calls me at some point in the midst of this experience. He's still out there somewhere west of Guam. And he says, Dad, there are 2 things you need to know about submarines. Since you've been asking me all these, these awful questions, about the nature of my choices, 2 things you need to know about submarines. I said, what are they? He said, the first thing is the submarine's trying to kill us. I said, oh, that's great. I said, what's that all about? I won't share that with your mother, but what do you mean by that? And he goes, well, there's a nuclear reactor on board. All U.S. submarines have nuclear reactors. They're fueled for 30 years. There's a nuclear reactor on board. It's a very cramped, tight space. It's like being in a dark space with whirring machines 24 hours a day. You get more than 50, 100 feet underwater, and they usually go much deeper than that. A pinhole, they take your arm off at a distance of 5 yards, right? So it's a very dangerous place. I said, well, that's terrific. I said, so what's the second thing? And he goes, it's our home. He said, we strap this thing on. I've got a rack on board. It's not worth, kind of a mangy dog's time, but we have these racks. We live on this thing. We bring food aboard, and we go out there, and we outwit, outmaneuver. We're more agile than our adversaries in that space for 4 or 5 months at a stretch. When we go below the surface of that water, we're out there 4 or 5 months at a time. Think about reconciling those 2 concepts. An inherently dangerous, imperfect, not perfectly fit for purpose platform, but it is an amazing machine, right? It's an extraordinary machine. But think about reconciling that to, but we strap this thing on anyway, and we use this, and we're going to be more agile, more audacious than our adversaries in that space. That's cyberspace. It's never going to meet our expectations. It cannot be secured. It'll never be perfect for all the reasons that we've discussed so far. But if we understand those deficiencies down to the deck plate, and we say, I'm going to strap this thing on, I'm going to be more audacious, I'm going to outwit, outmaneuver, take all of the reasonable precautions, but at the same time not be deterred in undertaking what I've got to go do, we'll be fine. We'll be just fine. I'll come back to that in a moment. The next level of this is an active defense, meaning that you need to actively counter adversaries coming at you. And this is where it deters or it departs, from traditional nuclear theory. Nuclear theory says, at all costs, we need to prevent the use of these things in the first place. This presumes that people are going to make use of this, and you need to therefore check them at every turn. This is almost like the broken pain theory of policing, which is if you've declared that something matters to you, if you've actually been vigilant enough about understanding what's happening on your networks, you then need to make sure that when somebody crosses or approaches that line, that some necessary and proportionate action takes place. And absent that, you will either confuse them or perhaps kind of give away those things that are hard-won and invested in the infrastructure itself. And then and only then, I'll say that again, then and only then, are you in a position where you can impose a consequence on an adversary. Now, I'm co-leading a study at this moment in time for the Defense Department trying to figure out how do we impose consequences on adversaries in and through cyberspace, right? That's a necessary thing, I think, to have in your arsenal. But in this space, as much as in all others, that must be a consequence, an extension of the defense, as opposed to the first thing you do. Because if it's the first thing you do, you're in a glass house to begin with, right? Turns out the infrastructure that you would hold at risk by imposing consequences on somebody is the very same one that your friends, allies, family are using. And it turns out that those things that you would use against them can immediately be picked up and used back against you. So the model has to work in the direction that I've indicated. Now you would see that something just came into view on the right side. Those are important. If we talk about classic deterrence, deterrence by denial, meaning that I'm going to deny you the opportunity to take advantage of me because it's just going to be harder for you to do than you had imagined. The cost is going to be too high. My resilience, my robustness, my locks, my doors, my fences are going to be just too hard for you to get by. That's classic deterrence. And frankly, if you're practicing that, you don't care who's coming at you, right? They essentially self-deter because they're not willing to bear that cost. The top of this is deterrence by cost imposition. You have to, at that moment, if you're going to go out and kind of smoke someone, impose a consequence, you have to know something about who they are. Which is why on the left side, I put these two, which is that only in these top layers do you require actual detection or the attribution of some action to somebody. These are the classic delimiters that people point out when they say we can't defend ourselves in this space because attribution is just so darn hard. Nonsense, right? So if you make this sufficiently resilient, sufficiently robust, you don't care who it is that failed in their hack last night, failed in their attempt last night. And I would tell you that at the technical level, if there are 3 things that we would do that we would deter by essentially denial, the vast majority of actors in this space. And they are, to a technologist, reasonable segmentation of fire breaks built into the infrastructure, two-factor authentication, meaning it's not just passwords that essentially extend privilege. You got to have some physical token. And then finally, the management of privilege broadly across these networks, right? The suppression of privilege where it's not necessary. If you did those three things, and most technologists, but they're hard and people don't find them to be very popular, we'd get rid of 85% of the problem. We'd be left with just the folks that are trying to challenge us at the top of that model. But let's talk about something more fun, more insightful, and perhaps then go to a wrap-up so that we can get out in the lawn and perhaps have a further discussion. I'm going to talk about the curious case of Finland. There's a fellow, I think his name is Reed Standish, who wrote this delightful article in Political.com in March of this year, and I just loved it. When I read it, I thought, that's it. Right? This is something that we need to embrace and take advantage of, thinking back to what happened to us in the year 2016. And the article opines, the Russians are coming after the Finns just like they're coming after everybody else in this space. They're practicing information war. That goes back to those days of the Soviet Union and earlier. They're practicing information war against them. Why are the Finns not particularly perturbed or particularly at risk from that? The author goes on to say three reasons. Right? The first reason is that the Finns have lived cheek by jowl alongside the Russians forever, right? Literally forever. Right? And so they are well practiced discriminating as to what is a Russian and what isn't. You have to work really hard to look like something other than a Russian if you live in that neighborhood because they know what they look like. That experience matters. Right? They paid a lot of time and attention to that. More importantly, the Finns have arguably one of the best, Dartmouth accepted, one of the best education systems on the planet. They teach their kids how to do what's called critical thinking. Now it's a lost art in the United States, but critical thinking essentially goes something like this, which is, don't just repeat something back to me, don't just give me the creed, the credo, the recitation. I want to know why you think that. I want to know what your facts are, and I want you to reconcile not just the facts you find convenient, but all of the available facts. Give that back to me in that way such that I can know that what you've said has a foundation of a comprehensive fact base. Think of how unusual that is in the United States today, but they teach their kids in Finland to do just that. And the third thing is, and this is the most important of all, is what the Finns do, is they essentially say, we're not going to wait for the Russians, right? We've got better things to do. We've got our own message. We've got our own game. The government goes to great pains to say, these are our strategic objectives, and they communicate those every way they can, whether that's by action, whether that's in the written word, the spoken word, and the collaborative actions that take place across a relatively compact society, 5.6 million people. But nonetheless, the Finns are moving at speed against their own objectives. So if you're a Russian, it's really a bad day for you. Because if you're a Russian, you've got to get over these three things. You've got to first catch the Finns. You've got to get up to the speed with them. You've got to look like something other than a Russian. And you have to make the case, get past the critical thinking skills. You have to make the case based on facts that you've got something worth considering. This is not about knocking down the other guy's message. This is not about saying, I'll just score the message, and that way people will naturally know that this is worth listening to. This isn't. This is about forming your own message. This is about the need for leadership, the need for a positive, compelling, motivating force that hand in glove with your ability to defend against the other message essentially makes it such that you prevail with your own message. Back to my story about, we could go after the German system in World War II, but unless we had a system and were more audacious about the prosecution of a good defense, about an ardent strategy forward, right, we're always going to find that the best we can do is break even, and most days we're losing. So let's talk a little bit about wrapping this up. First principles at the foundational level, I would say that this is not a technology issue, that this is first and foremost, this is an operational issue. And if you're in business, the private sector, the government, or if you just have a household, you need to think about these following things. Roles and expectations are absolutely essential. We can talk more about this in the Q&A. Second, more importantly, across jurisdictions, if convergence and collision is the reality of cyberspace, what I've described to you absolutely is a convergence of technology, a collision of ideology, and perhaps the mishmash of the person, the technology, and the expectations in that space, then integration and collaboration have to be a component of our response. We're going to be picked apart individually unless we collaboratively get our act together. We have to automate, use technology to our benefit to the extent that that's helpful, but bottom line, we're going to have to deal with imperfection. Think of the subdrivers and adversarial action. We're going to actually kind of apply human effort in this space in a collaborative fashion in order to prevail. And then finally, last chart, we have to engage in critical thinking. The conflict of ideas that is a bedrock of our society is still one of our best ideas. But if we allow that to be a conflict of people, we're lost. And think of in how many situations, whether it's this one or others, where we've essentially gone beyond a conflict of ideas, meritorious, and to a conflict of people. The idea might be stupid, but the person isn't. right? And so we need to, especially in this space, as the private sector and the public sector, as governments pull, try to figure out how they deal with this space, not so much accuse, but say, I need to collaborate with you in some way, shape, or form. Vigor, momentum, resilience is going to be the thing that puts the adversary in the defensive. We're not going to steal the initiative back from them unless we have our own speed. Think of the Finns. Got to catch me first. And then finally, collaborate within, across, in between, because diversity beats audacity every time. Diversity is an enormous strength if it's formed on common ground, and if unifying this, say, you're going to have to beat all of us, and we've got every one of us in the room. You have to beat all of us if you're going to beat any one of us. And we've got to do that as much or more as anything else. So I know I've expanded the briefing, perhaps beyond what's required. I think that it's about 10:10 at this moment in time. The doors are open. The lawn awaits. I'm happy to take questions individually, but we'll be back here in a better part of 20 minutes to start our Q&A. Thanks.
If I can have everybody's attention real quick, we've set up the breaks a little different today. The two tables that are underneath the tent, the canopy, if you form two lines, you can get coffee on either side of the tables outside to keep the lines going. And also, CATV is on site today if you want to order any of these tapes. They're on the back table against the elevator. Anybody who wants a catalog, we have fall catalogs here. And also, parking. I hope it's working better. We still have parking available at the Campion rink. Thank you.
One last thing, please be back here in 30 minutes, not 31 minutes, 30 minutes. We've got a lot to cover. right, can we get everybody seated? Let me try. Hey, we're going to start with the Q&A. I'd appreciate it if we can get everybody seated. I know there is a lot to cover in this. We're going to have to be out of here at 11:30 exactly, so there's a lot to cover in less than an hour. First question that I'm going to have Chris deal with is one that deals with every single one of us, leaves nobody out. And I'll simplify it by reading the question exactly as written. Should we all keep some cash under the mattress?
Might be better if you had some tangible assets in the larder. So if you kept cash in the mattress because you thought that the financial system might go down, then you might find yourself trying to insert that cash back into a financial system that didn't know what to do with it. And so, you know, if it's an ATM issue, if it's a kind of a temporary outage and your kind of component of the network, some cash on hand is a good idea. But probably more important to have some physical assets on hand, whether that's water, basic supplies, kind of rotate through that stock. That's probably the more important thing to bet on. And more importantly than that, the question goes to a really good corner, which is, do we have manual backups? Do we have something we can back into? I was telling somebody out in the lawn, I flew 3 variants of what was called the C-130. Forget what kind of an airplane that is, but the first was built in the late 1940s, early 1950s. It literally did have technology back to 1650. It had a sextant. And if you wanted to know where you were, you would shoot the moon, the sun, the stars, and this person that we called the navigator, would tell you where you were. And he'd give you a triangle about that big, and that was the size of Texas. But laid over the Pacific, that was good enough. And now in the last of the 3 C-130s that I flew, there's no navigator, there's no sextant, there's only an electronic system that actually generates a signal itself and uses gyros to update that, so it's called inertial navigation, or a GPS, right, a global positioning system that tells you plus or minus 3 feet, not plus or minus 24 miles, plus or minus 3 feet where you are. And the question is, if they fail, what then? Well, there's no navigator. Most pilots have no clue where they are, trust me. There's no navigator. There's no pilot. What's the backup? You know, what is the backup system? So at the United States Naval Academy, we're teaching midshipmen how to use sextants again. Now, we don't expect that they'll ever have to use a sextant, but what it does is it teaches them something about the lay of the land. It teaches them about the nature of geography. It teaches them something about the nature of north, south, east, west, so that it's not just this kind of soda straw perception of their cell phone that tells them where they are and where they should go, but rather they've got knowledge, muscle memory of the territory. And if they get off the path, they can still find their way out of the woods because they know the territory, not just the path. That's important for all of us in terms of navigating our way through a life where we have a dependence on critical resources like water and food and perhaps connectivity to loved ones. You need to figure out what's your backup plan and how will that work when the infrastructure goes down, hopefully for a little bit of time. But if that happens, should be no big deal, right? I get to actually talk face to face to somebody again. That's a joy.
Okay. What keeps you up at night?
I live in a neighborhood with a lot of kids. There's a terrier out back. So that's a great question. I would say that, let me give you the usual suspects and then say that's not it. So there's this clap of thunder in the night that might be the cyber Pearl Harbor. That could keep you up at night, but I don't think that's really our biggest problem. There's the slow leaching of integrity, resilience, robustness of this place called cyberspace, the Internet Plus. That many are ignoring, who should actually stand in and exercise some concurrent application of their talent, their authorities. That worries me a lot, but it's not the thing that worries me the most. The thing that keeps me awake at night is a culture that increasingly sees that we're going to solve these problems individually as opposed to collectively. Right? You know, we are a great society because we're populated from so many different places, so many different perspectives. And if we can figure out how to use all the talent in the room, all the perspectives, all the expertise, then there isn't anything we can't do, right? But if we give up on that, right, then this thing, whether it's an inanimate activity taking place on cyberspace or adversaries, and trust me, I mean, there are adversaries out there. They'll pick us off one at a time. That keeps me awake at night. How do we actually get back to where we believe that this is a common problem, common cause, and we're going to collaborate. We're going to participate in the conflict of big ideas, but only so that we can get to a place we can't go alone, right? That keeps me awake at night.
A number of questions that deal with the issue of our infrastructure. One is, how should we deal with, this is what the person wrote, so I'll use the word, irresponsible companies poor security, for example, AT&T and Verizon, do they enable hacking in their system? How do we deal with all this?
First, I would incentivize those companies to take care of what increasingly they realize is going to be a liability for them, if only in their inability to offer service and to accrue some benefit for that. So incentivize them to share information, to invest in the resilience and the robustness of their networks. And there are clearly some ways you can do that from a government's perspective. Reduce the liability that you expose yourself to when you admit a weakness. And all the tort lawyers in the world, I apologize to the tort lawyers in the room, but all the tort lawyers in the world come off the wall and essentially hold you at risk for liability that frankly is increasingly a shared liability. So incentivize them to do the right thing. Increasingly they're in a position where they want to do the right thing, but they're kind of feeling like they're at risk in doing it. Two, right, after you're done with that, hold them accountable, right? Apply some consequences for the lack of resilience and robustness in the infrastructure, especially as it affects other societal interests. So a company has a fiduciary responsibility. Sarbanes-Oxley essentially has CEOs sign off on that. So they clearly have to worry about that for their own direct stakeholders. But the institutions you've just described actually have a greater effect and increasingly an existential effect on society writ large. There needs to be accountability for that. The government needs to stand in and do its role to help them reduce the liabilities, provide government information, defend against those aggressors that those companies can't themselves defend against, but expect that they're going to play a part in that. What we're trying to set up is not a kind of a singular set of persons who accept the baton one after another, so that at any moment in time we're all kind of folding our arms in the audience watching the person at the mic do what they're supposed to do, but rather set up a symphony where there's this cacophony, this kind of multiplicity of talent, diversity, application of expertise, where we can defend this realm, defend this space. We do that actually reasonably well in the physical world. I locked my car when I left it at the Baltimore airport, not because Baltimore is an unsafe place, but that's my responsibility, that's my deal. I didn't leave an iPad on the hood of the car. I didn't leave the keys in the ignition because it makes it easier to get away. I never forget the keys because they're in the ignition. I didn't do that because I have a role to play. The police are at this moment in time making sure that people are obeying the speed limits and helping stranded motorists out on the streets, right, of this town. There are people over at airports screening passengers to get on the airplane to prevent terrorism from kind of getting into the air. There are harbor masters watching for the arrival of illicit cargo. There are military people who are defending us offshore in places like Afghanistan, Iraq. There's a group out in Colorado looking for a missile out of North Korea. And the deal is they do that work concurrently. If a missile gets fired out of North Korea today, those guys out in Colorado with military resources around the world, guys and gals, they're going to shoot that down. And they're not going to take a referendum before they do it. They're going to shoot it down, right? And all of us need to figure out what's our part in that activity. What do we do shoulder to shoulder concurrently to play our part in that? That's what we're really looking for in cyberspace, not who's in charge, but what do we do, each and every one of us, whether it's individual, organizational, sector-wise, private, public sector, governments plural, in a collaborative, integrated fashion to defend this realm. It's worked in other domains, the physical domain, it can work here.
Where do we stand in developing backups to our infrastructure to get them either off the net or make them less vulnerable to the net?
We got rid of most of them, in a kind of a goal for efficiency. So there aren't a lot of manual backups. They're coming back into vogue, and that's a good thing. So think about the Ukrainian situation. Let me talk about them first and give them a modest compliment, and then say what's the lesson for us. On December 23rd, 2015, what we believe to be the Russians effected a three-part attack on the Ukrainian electrical grid, an area the size of Texas. So not all of the Ukraine, but at least three sectors that were combining their efforts. First thing they did was they used the digital controls to open circuit breakers to stop the flow of electricity on that system. So all of a sudden, 220,000 subscribers lose their electricity. Second thing they did was to erase the digital controls, destroy the digital controls, so that if you're a network operator and you want to close the breakers, cause the electricity to flow, made it such that you couldn't do that. You couldn't reach on and actually throw those breakers back on again. And the third thing they did was, remember the Nerf ball attack? They did a denial of service attack, such that when people began to call in and say, hey, my electricity's out, they couldn't get through. And the responders, because the communications for the responders to talk to each other was on the same network, the responders couldn't talk to each other. It was brilliant. Each of those components was somewhat mediocre, right? You could stand back and say, well, I could do a better job, but it was brilliant in terms of the confluence of those three things at precisely the moment in time. It's kind of arriving on Christmas Day, right? It's not the same for them as it is for us, but it's the same season. Brilliant. What saved the Ukrainians was that they still had pickup trucks, megaphones, and they had manual breakers installed all over the system such that they could literally use those manual methods to coordinate, to deploy, and to throw a manual breaker back to get the electricity back on. And within 8 hours, most of the subscribers were back online again. So the manual backup saved their bacon. Now, the lessons they've taken is that we need to have a communication system that is what's called out of band. It can't be on the network that might be at risk. It needs to be outside of that. So they're going to have to invest in some pathways to say, how do we communicate with each other when the primary network is down, right? They've invested some further resources in how do we actually have the manual controls in that system. Put the digital controls in because they're efficient and they allow you to do things with a fewer number of people, but have the manual backup. And the third thing they've done is to invest a lot more time and attention in actually defending the network. Because that attack that occurred in December of 2015, it actually had inserted itself. The first kind of insertion was in March of 2015. It had been there building and growing for 9 months as the adversary essentially got a foothold, moved across a poorly defended network through firewalls. Those are like fire breaks, through firewalls that were supposed to prevent that traversal, that lateral transversal from an administrative system into the power generation system or distribution system. It simply wasn't defended. So if they better defend that network, if they had those manual controls, if they had those out-of-band communication kind of abilities, then they'll be more resilient, more robust in the face of an attack. They might just deter an attacker from trying in the first place because they say, hey, it's of no avail because these guys are resilient in the face of that. But if it happens, they'll be much more resilient and robust in the recovery. That's a great lesson for us, and I'm confident that the electrical sector within the United States is going through very similar discussions at this point in time. And they, more than just about any other sector, with the possible exception of the financial sector, feel like it's their liability, that they have a professional responsibility to get that right. That perhaps they, in their zeal to affect efficiency and effectiveness to reduce your electricity rates and perhaps up the performance, in their zeal to do that, they might have gone too far in digitizing that. So they're backing up. So I think that's getting to be a better news story every day. We're not in the best place right now.
Have they established a reasonable time frame for accomplishing that backup?
Now would be the reasonable time frame. That's hard. So what they're up against, I think the answer is yes, but. Within the means that are available to them, because most of these are they're public utilities, therefore they're expressly controlled by a local political apparatus, and the rates therefore that they can charge in order to acquire the capital investments and make those improvements, they're strictly controlled by the locals. And the locals are not very generous in that regard, and so sometimes you need to make the pitch to the local controlling apparatus, which is there for good purpose, that hey, there's something more that hangs in the balance here. This is not just reducing the liability of the company, but reducing the liability. Remember my three-stage model? This is reducing the liability, the existential properties of the strategic effect, or perhaps what the society depends upon at that middle layer. This isn't just about defending their infrastructure, about defending the electrical sector's infrastructure. You need to do the abstraction. And when I think the local control elements begin to understand that, they're like, okay, we need to perhaps turn the spigot on a little bit. And so when somebody comes to you and says, we're going to have a rate increase, you can't immediately go straight to your congressman or your senator. You need to think, so what is this for? And am I willing to pay that penny per kilowatt or whatever that might be for that greater resilience and robustness? We all have a part to play in this in terms of saying we don't simply allow this, that we're actually going to cry out for this, compel this.
You're spending a good deal of your time these days in advising a number of companies on these issues. Are you getting resistance? Are you getting understanding? Are you getting any real understanding of the nature of the problem?
The answer is yes. So there's a lot more understanding. I think that there was an inflection point. If you all remember, I think it was about 3 years ago when the Target Corporation was hacked. And within a fairly short period of time, the CEO lost his job. And the board found themselves being sued for their fiduciary responsibility, their liability, because the kind of welfare of the company was at risk. And all of a sudden, this became a pretty serious issue inside of boardrooms. Now, with no cynicism whatsoever, I would just say that's an appropriate realization on their part. Every other board in the country couldn't help but to look over, that hedgerow. Some thinking, well, thank goodness, I'm not that person. Turns out we're all in the same boat. And it doesn't matter where the hole in that boat is. We're all in the same boat. Most corporations, and I would say, across government, whether it's the federal or the state or local level, most of them are getting this. This is not a technology issue that you can throw over the transom to the technologist. This is an operational issue, and the liability goes all the way to the top. Fewer of them realize what they can practically do at the board level or at the agency or department head level. They don't really have the lexicon, the language. Somebody from the technology side comes in and says to them, I need $10 million to do two-factor authentication so we can stop a cross-scripting attack, a cross-site scripting attack. Excellent. Everybody breaks eye contact at that point. Nobody has any idea what that conversation's all about, right? And so what's now happening in those boardrooms is that you're training the technologist to actually speak the business, right? It's like, look, here's our business aspirations. Here's what we have as our business strategy. Reach new customers, serve them in new ways, whatever that might be. And then the technologists need to translate that into, and so here's the resilience, the robustness, the things we need to defend the infrastructure that essentially makes that possible. That discussion is much richer now, but it's nascent. And it's taking some of these pratfalls. The WannaCry 2 was another big wake-up call. Petya last week, another big wake-up call. So that you now have the full attention of all of these parties. You don't yet have the rich dialogue that actually means something, that kind of can be translated into human action. It's not as rich yet. And so there's some further work to be done in that regard. Technologists need to move to the middle. The operators need to move to the middle because this is a shared problem.
Changing the geography a bit, are groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda cyber literate enough to soon be able to use cyber weapons in an apoplectic destruction attack?
I think the answer is yes, but we've not seen much of it. And the question is why? So I talked at length about the threats that might be constituted to data, infrastructure, or things that depend upon that, critical infrastructure, societal, right, expectations. In the realm of, data might be stolen, data might be disrupted, data might be permanently destroyed, or infrastructure might suffer those three things. I didn't talk enough until I got to the Russian example about the idea of proselytization, about the messaging, about the information war. I would say that Al-Qaeda, ISIS, ISIL, they're pretty good at that. And they therefore have spent most of their precious time, and they only have so many hours in the day when they can conduct their murder and mayhem. They've spent most of it on that. And they've achieved great effect from that. Just look at their ability to recruit at a distance people they never meet by using the precious time and talent they have on creating the slick propaganda, on essentially reaching out and cultivating across that network. So in a world of choices, for their purposes, they've made a high-value choice. They've not then engaged in trying to disrupt or destroy or to conduct surveillance. Those things aren't as interesting. They're not as impactful for them as the primary purpose that they've used that for. So I think that explains it. Could they? Absolutely. Turns out that the cost of entry into this space is relatively low. I was once quoted for saying this, but I'll say it again, which is if this game, this kind of offense on offense, if this was the game of soccer, we'd be 20 minutes into the game and the score would be 462 to 453. There's really not much of a defense anywhere you look, and any offense will do. Right? There's a classic chart that has been shown by the U.S. Intelligence Committee, now declassified, which shows across two axes, right, the kind of scope, scale, kind of breadth of capability that an adversary might have, and then the technical expertise they might have. So one is like, do they have this enormous capacity? The other is, do they have some deep expertise? And the usual suspects show in the upper right-hand corner of this chart. A lot of capacity, a lot of expertise. The Russians are up there. The United States is up there. Kind of other nations that you might think are kind of technically sophisticated are up there. The Iranian nation states typically classically put down here at about the halfway point, and a lot of other actors are kind of languishing well behind. It's the wrong chart. What it does is to compare offense to offense. What you need is the comparison of the offense to the defense. And if it was a comparison of the offense to the defense, all the defenses are down here, and all the offenses kind of in a relative measure, they're up here. And that's what we need to think our way through. So ISIS, ISIL haven't done much in the deny, destruct, disrupt range, but they could. And why haven't they? Because they're working on something that's more impactful for them, which brings me back to we need to not just defend on level 1, we need to defend really hard on level 2. And the only way we're going to win an information war is to have a message of our own, right? And to overwhelm that message as opposed to simply spending our time knocking down theirs.
During the Obama administration, we all read in the papers that President Obama had, in talking to Xi in China, said that you have got to do something to stop the cyber attack of your Chinese companies against the United States, and a lot of theft of intellectual property and company secrets and so forth. Are we able to monitor that? Are we making progress? Do you have a feel for that?
I do, in an unclassified way, so I'm not cut into what the classified version of the story is, which may be different. But my sense is that she was surprised on 2 counts. Surprised that we would counter him, that he would essentially be audacious enough to put that on the table. And two, I think he was probably surprised at the scope, the breadth of his nation state's adversarial action in this space. Probably came to conclude that they perhaps were excessive in that, and that it wasn't as well coordinated as it might be, that was essentially from his side to ours, not as efficient, not as effective in terms of making sure that there was an allocation of priorities, expectations, responsibilities. So my bet is when he went back, he did two things. One, he said, hey, we're more visible than you know. And two, we're noisy. We're like a noisy herd of buffalo on the near horizon. So we perhaps ought to kind of scope that effort down, make sure that we're going after those things that truly matter, achieve some degree of efficiency in terms of who's doing what, who's who in the zoo. But we gave him an out, which was that we said in that discussion, it is okay, it's expected that one nation will spy on another for national security purposes. It is not okay for a nation to spy on another to aid and abet, to enrich, right, its private sector, right? So, our own pitch in that regard is that the United States will try to do surveillance, steal the secrets of adversary nations to keep our nation and allies safe. We will not steal secrets from other people to enrich our private sector. We just don't do that. We'll create a level playing field, but we won't give those secrets to Boeing or General Electric or others to aid and abet them. Imagine if you're Xi and you hear that message. It's like, it's okay for national security, but not to enrich the private sector. The notion of a private sector in China is fundamentally different than the notion of a private sector here. Many of those entities are part of the national enterprise, part of the national security. So it's a pretty large get-out-of-jail-free card. Right? And so my bet is that the Chinese are better behaved. They're perhaps toning down, tamping down, right, that massive theft of intellectual property. It's still going on. It probably still crosses a line that we're uncomfortable with because the nature of their enterprise, their society is fundamentally different. And I offer just this one, perhaps a mean-spirited comment, not for anyone, but for us to think about. It might be that they've stolen everything worth stealing. And what they want to do now is to essentially, on that level playing field, try to figure out how do they achieve a degree of innovation going forward. And we would be arrogant to think that any nation state, let alone the Chinese nation state, can't go stride for stride with us in terms of innovating on that flat field, on that common platform. And so we better make sure that we're confident in our own ability to innovate as much as we're perhaps confident in somebody else's inability to do that.
Let's move one country next door, North Korea. Could we shut down the entire North Korean cyber infrastructure, missiles, electronic systems, centrifuges?
I suspect not. I think we could have a pretty dramatic effect on the North Korean cyber infrastructure. Kind of think of it as the Internet plus and add in the systems that the government directly depends upon. But to a much greater degree than us, they've got a lot of fire breaks built into that architecture. They have a lot of manual activities that are undertaking the infrastructure. And I don't think so much because that they've been thinking their way through the resilience and robustness question and perhaps carefully investing in the backup systems we talked about earlier. They just haven't had a chance to go the distance that we have in doing the digitization and the mass embrace of these technologies. And so they find themselves in a fortunate situation. They haven't actually run past their headlights yet. They're not over that red line yet. And so I think that we could go a long way to shutting down. It could certainly shut them off from the rest of the world, but they still have shortwave radios. They still have all manner of manual abilities to connect. I think you'd find that a lot of systems that still hold us at risk, kind of unto themselves, separate, segregated from the rest of that collective infrastructure, would still be there. And now we have provoked them in a way that we're not entirely certain what their response would be. They're not, in my view, the most rational kind of nation on the planet, but they are, in fact, with their mediocre capabilities. Once somebody described for me at NSA, it might have been you, Bill, the North Koreans have the most successful nuclear program on the planet. Not because their physicists are worth a hoot, but rather because it achieves all of their objectives, which is that they've got some mediocre capabilities, they rattle that saber from time to time, and the nations that they want to kind of have a compelling interest from and in come running to the table. Right? And so they understand that. And so in some ways, while he's swimming at the low end of the gene pool, right, so his father and his grandfather weren't the best kind of lineage to brag about, he's crazy like a fox on some days, and he does, in fact, have some benefit, some advantage that we can't hold him at risk in the same way he can hold us at risk. So.
How secure are our own nuclear systems? Are we totally comfortable?
My God, look at the time. I don't know. I would say that I'm not paid to answer that question. I therefore could only surmise that that has to be one of the most important obligations that this nation enjoys, vested in the military, of course, and a large degree of private sector support. But we should not assume, right, that those, based upon the techniques of the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, are equally resilient and robust in this day and age. And so we should work that really, really hard. I just don't know. So.
How do you feel, what's your sense of us being absolutely certain about the Russian attack on the Democratic National Party and into some of our state electoral instructions? Do we, some statements are being made that, well, we're not sure. Could be anybody. Right. How certain are we?
Right. So there are generally two truths in intelligence, that intelligence is great at secrets, terrible at mysteries. So let's take the secret, right? So I think the intelligence community came out and gave 17 thumbs up. If you know the U.S. intelligence community, can't do anything once. We have 17 different intelligence organizations within the larger intelligence community. Some of them concentrate on imagery, some of them on signals intelligence, NSA, some of them on the collection of human intelligence. But all 17 of them came out and said, I think with something from medium to high confidence, that it was the Russians, right, who made a run at the Democratic National Committee, and therefore made a run by extension, think of that third level, made a run by extension at the confidence we might have in the election system in 2016. I think there's bordering on certainty. And so would I bet otherwise? No. I mean, in this case, I would normally bet your house on something like that. I'd bet my house on something like this. The question is, what were they trying to do, right? What were their aspirations? What was their true intent? Did they actually think that they could move an election from one candidate to another? I don't think so. I don't have the evidence in hand to know, but I don't think so. My bet is that they thought that the best they could do was to wound the presumptive victor in that race, such that that person was weaker as an executive of the nation that they thought was most challenging to their aspirations in the world, and that they were themselves surprised when the election went the other way. Now, are they wholly accountable for throwing the election the other way? I don't think so. I think at the end of the day, they probably didn't change a single vote. And so the Electoral College kind of came up with a result that we must respect, because I bet when it's all said and done, you're not going to find any fraud in there, and you're not going to find that the Russians literally changed a vote from one side to the other. You can explain the election on a lot of different things, not least of which is if there had been a third rung on the ballot, which is, party one, party two, mad as hell would have won in a landslide, right? And we have to think our way through that. And all of the things that then constitute how do we put the choices up that we prefer, as opposed to choosing amongst what we oftentimes say is the worst of all possible choices. So I've strayed from the question you've asked. I'm pretty confident the Russians are back there. I just don't know what their aspirations are. And I would say that as opposed to countering them at every turn, which is going to be meritorious, we need to figure out what our own way forward is and make it such that the Russians have to actually catch up and defeat us on merit, based upon the facts, based upon vision, not based upon their ability to manipulate that lowest possible tier.
One question we can't avoid deals with Edward Snowden. Who is that? And two parts. One, why was he able to steal the classified material as easily as done? And two, how disastrous is the effect on U.S. intelligence of what he revealed?
Right. So how was he able to do that? It turns out, so at the end of the day, NSA is the accountable party for allowing that to happen. So, lay that right at the feet of me and other people. But here are the circumstances that essentially led to that. About 2002, there was a law passed that said, as a matter of efficiency, the federal government should not be doing its own information technology work. It should contract that out. Because it's done at better scope and scale, it's a commodity, and therefore the economies of scale would benefit the U.S. taxpayer, and by extension those who stand in the shoes of the taxpayer, a place like NSA, of using that, which is why largely the information technology function at NSA was contracted out to a broad array of private contractors. If you're a contractor in the federal government, you are by definition a commodity. Now that sounds like a harsh term to apply to a human being, but by the law, you're not allowed to invest in that person. So when that person shows up on your campus, you essentially say, sit down, there's your space, you're supposed to start doing the work that you've been hired to do. If you're an NSA employee and you show up on that campus, on day one, you come over to the NSA museum. I'm the chair of that museum. Anybody wants a tour of a great museum, we get 70,000 visitors a year. This is the only advertisement you'll ever see. It's a wonderful thing. We take all of our new employees over there and we kind of tell them our story. We tell them all the way back to the dawn of time, why we existed, what we did, war saved, lives saved, disasters averted. We tell them about the nature of their history. We connect them to that to say the world's still a dangerous place. And we then at the end of that say, that's why you're here, and I need you to take the oath to the Constitution, because that's the bedrock value that essentially connects us to this work. And if anybody asks you to violate that oath, that sworn oath to the Constitution, your fundamental obligation is to say no, right? And then having essentially approximated them, enculturated them to the NSA proposition, what's the noble purpose, constraints and controls, we then cut them loose to say, now go exercise those capabilities, which are terrible capabilities. We spy on people, right? That shouldn't be a secret. We don't spy on U.S. persons. We don't spy on innocents. We spy on the people that we should spy on, whether it's the North Koreans, the Iranians, ISIS, ISIL, right? There are too many of them in order for us to stray to the people we shouldn't. But it's the noble purpose, the constraints and the controls that essentially are the bookends that guide us to that work. Snowden didn't get that, all right? So he signed a piece of paper that says he's obligated to not disclose classified information. So think about Edward Snowden. He's a contractor. He's got this incredibly important work. He's a SharePoint administrator. For those of you who don't know what that is, job of a SharePoint administrator is to find information of value and to post that for the benefit of everybody else. And his particular job at NSA Hawaii was to find information about how does NSA collect information, process information, use massive supercomputers to sometimes decrypt information, how does it store it, how does it query it, how does it form, right, analytic kind of hypotheses, how does it ship it? Because those are all done differently for each thing that we might go after, right? So think of the various questions that were asked. They might communicate differently, they might use different encryption schemes, they might show up in different places of the world. It's a very tailored approach that a given analyst would use. So the analyst needs to know the toolkit. Edward Snowden's job was to essentially populate the toolkit and say, here these things are. So he shows up, got a relatively large ego. I'm not a psychologist, I'll just observe that at a distance. He's told on day one, you're not that special, you're a contractor, sit down, do your job. He's not enculturated, has a workplace incident where he comes to the conclusion that he's not been properly respected by his boss. Whether that gives him entitlement to do the kind of damage he did, that's what he chose to do. And then using this privilege that he had, he operates low and slow, never once crosses a line, and for the better part of the next year, secretes information little by little. Now I would tell you that any organization has to extend privilege, some degree of trust to everyone in the place. I mean, that just by virtue of the fact that they're there, you got to do that. And if they, with malice aforethought, say, I'm going to operate low and slow beneath the radar screen, they can and will beat you, right? Because that's what it means to actually extend trust. You take the risk, and sometimes that risk comes back to bite you. So the mistake we made wasn't so much extending the trust to him. It wasn't so much allowing him to exercise that function. That was out of our hands. My view, it was not enculturating him and all the other contractors in violation of U.S. law, I would observe, but in not enculturating him and making him feel like his first remedy, if he had a legitimate concern, he did not, but if he had a legitimate concern, his first remedy should be go back to the people that essentially, he felt some kindred spirit with, right? Now, as to the nature of the damage he did, it was severe, enormous, right? We lost as many as what are called targets. So think of if NSA is asked a question about rogue country X, that's a target. Right? If they're asked a question about transnational entity, organized crime, or illicit transfer of cargo, that's a target. We lost access to upwards of 1,000 of those for a period of time. But I would tell you that we're not doing the work the same way we did it in 1942 in the year 2017. So there's a natural progression, right? Technology changes, operational practice changes, the mistakes, the hubris, the arrogance of our adversaries changes, and so there's a natural progression. And my bet is, without having direct access to that we're back in the right place. We're doing, the work that we should be doing, helping to keep a nation safe, coalitions safe again. But the damage that he's done that lasts is the scar tissue between possibly the American public and the National Security Agency, certainly between the legislative and the executive branches, and mostly based on allegations, not revelations. The vast majority of what Edward Snowden claimed, because he only saw this at a distance, he was not actually doing operations, he could only observe what the mechanics of those operations were. The vast majority of what he claimed simply wasn't true. The idea that an analyst could target the President of the United States from his or her desk. It's nonsense, not just on a cultural level, but in terms of the mechanics of how that would be done. It's just impossible to do, and so on and so forth. And so we've spent a lot of time chasing those allegations. There was some heartbreak at NSA. They weren't so much shocked and dismayed as they were heartbroken that somebody might accuse them of that, and that they might be found to be suspect of that by the likes of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and even the Congress. And that was hard to earn back. And my bet is, at this moment when we need that kind of collaboration between an NSA or a CIA, or for that matter, the federal government and the private sector that it would serve, right, that scar tissue is not serving us very well. So I have no other opinions on the matter.
Could you just briefly describe the measures taken within NSA to protect the privacy of the U.S. citizens relative to their communications?
Yeah, so can I actually use, by way of example, the much maligned 215 telephone metadata program? So that program, as you might have recalled, about June 5th, 2013, Guardian newspaper released something called the secondary order. It was an order from the court to a particular telecommunications provider saying, release to NSA all of the telecommunications metadata meeting the following criteria into, across, and out of the United States. It's the secondary order. The reason it was the secondary order is it was this capability in the middle of that bookend kind of theory that I gave you earlier. The primary order, which you didn't choose to release, the primary order described what's the noble purpose for which you might have that data, and what are the constraints and controls, right, that you would be honor-bound to respect if you had that data. Only kind of after you kind of get the first two of those bookends, can you possibly understand what the middle of that is. But he didn't release that. So here are the bookends. The bookends, in my view, were designed more to defend privacy than they were to pursue collective security. So why do you have a telephone metadata database? Turns out that the 911 Commission took NSA, some others, but NSA to task for failing to connect the dots. Right? So you all remember that turn of phrase. And that was correct. We did not connect at least one dot that comes to mind, possibly some others. There was a member of the terrorist conspiracy, the al-Qaeda conspiracy, who was in Sana'a, Yemen, who was communicating with one of the 19 terrorists in San Diego, California. And NSA only got half of that conversation. The reason, it's some technical kind of issues associated with that. But it turns out communications in the world typically are routed, the outbound goes one way, the inbound goes another way. The control that says what either party's kind of identifying information is, that's on a third link. It's very complicated stuff, but in many cases, NSA gets one of those three parts. So we can hear a person that we have legitimate interest in Sana'a, Yemen, communicate to somebody who we can't hear the response from that person. We just know that this person's talking about a conspiracy against U.S. interest. The word San Diego never comes up. The word American plot never comes up. We're thinking through the coal disaster, the bombing of 2000. We're thinking this is likely to take place in and around the Middle East, and so that's a consideration of ours. If we'd only known that the other side of this conversation was San Diego, it would have tripped a whole set of investigations and perhaps some intrusive work in the United States. Why don't you do that? Because you don't want to intrude upon the privacy of U.S. persons. So the remedy for that after 9/11 was we need to have a way that if we suspect this person's engaged in a plot against the United States, to check to see if there's another end of that is in the United States. The only way we can come up with, and I would tell you to this day, the only sure way that you can come up with is to have a database that essentially has the two ends, right, the kind of either end of that to say, this thing connected with this thing. And the minimum set of data necessary is the number on either side, the time that took place, and the duration of the call. Duration's important. If it's less than 6 seconds, it's not a call. It's probably a failed call, right? If it's more than 6 seconds, that matters. If it's more than 2 minutes, it's probably a collaboration of some sort. So the time of it matters, and the time of the actual call you need so that you understand something about how would I pursue this. There's no identity information, there's no geolocation information, there's no content information in the database. Why? In deference to the privacy of U.S. persons, because this is a pretty intrusive database. So how's it work? Right, I told you the noble purpose. The constraints and controls are you can only check that database. This is well before Snowden came out. You can only check it if you have a reasonable suspicion that this person that you're interested in is engaged in a plot against the United States. And to do that, you have to show that they're affiliated with one of 3 different terrorist organizations, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and a nation state known to sponsor terrorism that I can't mention now because that's still classified, but think about what they might do to the U.S. financial infrastructure. Right? So if it's one of those 3, right, then you can query this database in a reasonable suspicion that this person has crossed the scene. And when you query the database, you're constrained not just for those circumstances, but you're constrained in terms of how far you can go across that database. So in all of 2012, we queried that database 288 times, the year before Edward Snowden came out. And I can tell you I can remember every one of those, because in every one of those, we had 13 hits, 13 positive hits. Every one of those I had to go kind of call my counterpart at the FBI, because we were turning this over, the crossing of the seam over, and I would always say, we had a hit. He would always say, great, what was the number that was called? I'd give that. He'd say, where is that number? I'd say, I have no idea. He'd say, what did they talk about? I have no idea. He said, where is this person? I have no idea. Because those were features, right? That was essentially defense of US privacy. What I was giving that person was essentially the smoke detector saying, there's a fire in the house, right? And while most of you have smoke detectors and you've never had to use those things, you still have them in your house because it detects the crossing of a really important seam. There are particulates in the air that give you cause to believe that there's something in a house you need to go find. And in deference to US person privacy, right, we put all those constraints and controls on it. So those 13 times when we did have a hit, in one of those we found that there was a material plot that was already under investigation. It increased the resources given to that, and it was caught just at the time that person got to Times Square and was about to do murder and mayhem. Can I prove that the telephone metadata was in fact the thing that kind of turned the trick? I can't. And in the other 12, it applied enough time and attention to it to say that we've convinced ourselves that nothing there. But the 275 times when it came up with nothing, we actually freed up FBI resources to say you should spend your time on something else. There's no American connection to this plot. Actually preserved a further intrusion from taking place into US person communications and saved precious resources to spend on what they will. I would tell you that every program at NSA works almost exactly the same. There's always got to be a noble purpose. The 10th Amendment says the federal government can't do what it's not explicitly authorized to do. There are constraints and controls, and then and only then can you unleash this terrible capability of surveillance. And I say that with all the kind of honesty in my heart, that surveillance can, if abused, be a terrible thing. And so we have to constrain it to this middle place between those two bookends.
I'm going to check my time here a bit. Okay, one last question. Is an international cyber agreement possible?
Between what parties?
All. Government and private.
Yeah, no more than an international agreement is possible on anything that you could pick. But is international the way to go? Absolutely. Right. You know, this space is it runs roughshod across those boundaries, and therefore we should strive at every turn to find like-minded nations, to get them to agree on how we will collaborate to understand threats in this space, suppress those threats, hold those threats at risk. Absolutely, because no one nation can do this alone. Should we essentially be completely trusting of certain adversaries in this space and put all of our tools, all of our insights on the table? No. Now, it sounds a bit mean-spirited, but we need to be honest about the fact that their interests and ours don't always align. But there are nations that I think that we could go a very long way with. I mean, the traditional Five Eyes relationship, the Europeans, many South American countries, they're just dying for the sort of collaborative relationship where we'd say, look, we can essentially have a rising tide raise all boats. And then we can at least engage the ones that we don't think would essentially be truly helpful in this regard, in part communicating to them that we're serious about this, communicating to them what we would find to be inappropriate and egregious, possibly holding them in check, and getting them in the longest way of time to collaborate on some things. In so doing, I think you begin to remove the black space, the gray space, and create greater white space between them. It'll never be complete. So.
Chris, I can't thank you enough. This is an exceedingly complex.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. Good questions.